The lethal danger that inflation poses is that it undermines the value of being paid a fixed rate of interest on a bond.
If inflation goes up to 10% and the value of a fixed rate interest is only 5, then that basically means that the bondholder is falling behind inflation by 5%.
That's why at the first whiff of higher inflation, bond prices fall, and in some cases, keep falling. To see just how bad things can get when the inflationary genie escapes from the bottle, you just have to look at the example of Argentina. Many Argentines date the steady decline of their economic fortunes to a day in February 1946 when the newly elected president, General Juan Domingo Perón, came here to the central bank in Buenos Aires. He was astonished at what he saw. There is so much gold, he marveled. You could hardly walk through the corridors. The very name Argentina suggests wealth, plenty. It means the land of silver. The river flowing past the capital is the Rio de la Plata, the Silver River.
Once upon a time, there used to be 2 Harrods in the world. One in London, Knightsbridge, and the other here, in the Avenida, Florida, in the heart of Buenos Aires. Founded in 1912, this other Harrods is a reminder that Argentina used to be a rich country. Indeed, at one time, its per capita income was just 18% less than that of the United States. Investors who flocked to buy Argentine bonds hoped that Argentina would become the United States of South America. Well, Argentina's history since then is a classic illustration that all the resources and talent in the world can be set at naught by chronic financial mismanagement.
There have been many financial crises in Argentine history, but the crisis that hit the country in 1989 was unparalleled. At the beginning of February, the country was suffering one of the hottest summers on record. In Buenos Aires, the electricity system just couldn't cope. 5-hour power cuts were commonplace. But these, as it turned out, were the least of Argentina's problems. As is almost always the case, there were several well-trodden steps to monetary hell. In step 1, the government spends more, much more than it can raise in taxation. Usually, but not always, it's because of a war. In Argentina's case, there were 2. One, a civil war between generals and the left in the 1970s. The other, a foreign war against Britain over the Falkland Islands in 1982. By 1989, the financial system was about ready to blow. By February, inflation had already reached 10%. Per month. Banks were ordered to close as the government tried to lower interest rates and prevent the currency's exchange rate from collapsing. It didn't work. In just a month, the Austral fell 140% against the dollar. At the same time, the World Bank froze lending to Argentina, saying that the government had failed to tackle the root cause of inflation, a bloated public sector deficit. With no cheap loans forthcoming from the World Bank, the government tried to finance its deficit by selling bonds to the public. But investors were hardly likely to buy bonds with the prospect that their real value would be wiped out by inflation in just a matter of days. Nobody was buying. The government was running out of options. In April, furious customers overturned shopping trolleys after one supermarket announced over the loudspeaker that prices were being raised by 30% immediately. Shops emptied of goods as owners weren't making enough money to buy new stock.
fueron meses muy malos, muy malos. Porque a la mañana tenías un precio, a mediodía tenías otro, entonces no podían vender porque la gente perdía, los dueños de los bares perdían. Yo vendía, lo vendía a un precio y le llegaba a otro. Y era continuo, 3 o 4 veces en el día cambiaban los precios.
Government bond prices plunged as fears rose that the central bank's reserves were running out. With no foreign loans and no one willing to buy bonds, there was only one thing left for an increasingly desperate government to do: get the central bank literally to print more money. But they couldn't even get that right. On Friday, April the 28th, Argentina literally ran out of money. It's a physical problem, the central bank vice president told a news conference. What he meant was that Argentina's mint had run out of paper to print new notes, and the printers had gone on strike. I don't know how we're going to do it, but the money has got to be there on Monday, he declared. Yet the faster the printing presses rolled, the less the money was worth. The government was forced to print higher and higher denominations of notes. In May, the price of coffee went up by 50% in a week. Farmers stopped bringing cattle to market, as the price for one cow was now the same as for 3 pairs of shoes. By June 1989, inflation in Argentina had reached a monthly rate of 100%, an annual rate of roughly 12,000%. To put that into concrete terms, if you wanted to go out for dinner in Buenos Aires on a Saturday night, in May you'd pay 10,000 Australes. By June, you'd have to pay 20,000 for the same meal. And by the following month, it would take 60,000. You've heard of a fistful of dollars. Well, you needed a drawer full of Australes just to buy a square meal. In June, popular frustration erupted in 2 days of intense rioting and looting by hungry mobs. At least 14 people died. In a country where a steak and a bottle of wine were on practically every table every day, thousands were eating in soup kitchens or going hungry. It's obvious enough who loses from hyperinflation. Very rapidly rising prices are bound to wipe out anybody who's dependent on an income that's fixed in cash terms. Groups like academics and civil servants on inflexible monthly salaries, old age pensioners, and particularly bondholders living off the interest on their investments. Buenos Aires is absolutely full of antique shops like this one, laden down with jewellery and watches and cutlery, all sold off by middle-class families who just ran out of cash. In the 1920s, the great economist John Maynard Keynes had predicted the euthanasia of the bondholder, anticipating that inflation would eat up the paper wealth of financial families like the Rothschilds. As inflation swept through the world in the 1970s, Keynes seemed to be proved right. In our time, however, we've seen a miraculous resurrection of the bondholder, a comeback by Mr. Bond, even in Argentina. The bond market is back, terrifying American officials as they try to fund a massive financial bailout by, you guessed it, selling billions of dollars of freshly minted bonds. The key to Mr. Bond's revival has been a growth in the number of bondholders. Which brings us back to Italy, where the bond market was born 600 years ago. Italy is now a country with one of the most rapidly aging populations in Europe. In such a greying society, there's a growing demand for fixed-income securities like bonds. But there's also a strong fear of inflation, eating up the real value of pensions and savings. Central bankers suspected of being soft on inflation have to answer to the pensioner's friend, the bond market. And Treasury's planning to spend billions to bail out banks that have gone bust in the current credit crunch have to tread warily too if they expect to raise the money by selling yet more bonds.
In modern Europe, as in Renaissance Italy, an equilibrium has been struck between political power and financial exposure. Today, as much as ever, it seems it's the bond market, our old friend Mr. Bond, that really rules the world.
But what if, rather than lending to governments, you prefer to use your money to buy a share in a company? Would that be more or less risky? More or less profitable? In the next episode of The Ascent of Money, we'll discover why we find it so hard to learn from financial history, despite nearly 300 years of stock market bubbles and busts.